My name is Paul Steinke, and I'm the general manager of this great historic public market. When Dr. Anderson first contacted me last year and asked if he could host his official book launch event for his new book, Cosmopolitan Canopy, it took me about 5 seconds to say yes, maybe even less. We are greatly honored to be the subject of a major part of his book and to be the site of this evening's book launch event. And we have a distinguished panel lined up in front of you. And to introduce them, it's my pleasure to introduce the host of the PBS NewsHour, senior correspondent on PBS, and the author of, among other books, The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Suburban Migration, Mr. Ray Suarez.
Thanks a lot. It's a big panel.
It is big.
Well stocked with big brains. So I'm. Can I see everybody? Okay. Yes, I can see everybody. This is not an optimal setup. I may have to come down so I can where you are so I can see them later on. But I thought it would be best to begin so that we all know what the what is of the Cosmopolitan Canopy, to start with Professor Elijah Anderson to lay out the thesis that runs through the book, the ideas set out in the Cosmopolitan Canopy, and then have our panel go to town on those ideas and respond to them, critique them, embrace them, whatever they plan to do. So why don't we begin with a longtime member of this community and a leading light among American sociologists, a longtime associated with the University of Pennsylvania, now at Yale, Professor Elijah Anderson.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here before you. I couldn't have a better book reception. It's already a success. The book, The Cosmopolitan Canopy, has been a long time coming. I think I started writing this book about 30 years ago. And it materialized and crystallized as I got to know Philadelphia better and better and better. And so many friends of mine helped me. We called them subjects, but they were friends in ethnography and sociology. This is an ethnographic study. Ethnography is a peculiar way of doing social science in a way. And probably the most important difference between what we do as ethnographers and what ordinary sociologists might do with their numbers and what have you is that we put our bodies in the field. My friend Paul Willis is here, and he's written about just this method and how we do this. But I want to underscore that. We put our bodies in the field, and we learn from spending time with real people, observing, hanging out, living among them, reflecting, questioning. Ethnography is the systematic study of culture, and the ethnographer, as he writes about the people and comes to an understanding of it all, tries to render that situation. But as I say, her body is there. And from that kind of interaction, one learns, one comes to understand, one comes to be able maybe to represent in a way that makes sense, not only to the people that you would write about, but in some sense, you're speaking truth to power. You see, the ethnographer becomes something of a communicator, a communication link between how people live in everyday life and the wider world. David Reisman, the great sociologist, once said that good social science, good sociology, is like a conversation between classes. And what I've tried to do here is contribute to that conversation. This book, The Cosmopolitan Canopy, is about these spaces in cities, in Philadelphia in particular, where people, diverse people, come together and function and live and get along. And all of this is going on in a sea of segregation. It's an island of civility in a sea of racial segregation. And it has its own problems, because not everything under the canopy is pretty. But what I've done here, I think, is to identify this peculiar space in cities where all different kinds of people come together, learn from one another, observe one another, do their own folk ethnography, so to speak, and then take what they learn back to other areas of society. So there's a way in which the canopy is an ongoing concern, an ongoing institution, and people learn from their experience there. I think to be better people, to be better people. And some of this has to do with just being able to operate in life, to be a better participant. So people from some of the most ethnocentric communities in the city come to the canopy, and through their exposure become marginally more sophisticated for having visited the canopy. And I don't mean that they become necessarily less ethnocentric, but they become better able to behave as cosmopolitan people, practicing, as it were. They become edified through this experience. An essential tension in the book is between ethnocentrism and cosmopolitanism. All of us have some cosmopolitan in us, I like to think, some of us more. And all of us have some ethnocentrism in us. The canopy says to us, with its norms and values and expressions of such, express your cosmopolitan side and keep your ethnocentric side in check, as it were. That's what it said. Those are the norms. And by and large, we do. And people who are truly cosmo probably don't have much work to do under the canopy. They feel pretty much at home. For people who are profoundly ethnocentric, they have to work. They have to work. And it's not always easy. They get tired. They get weary. And when they do get weary, some of their ethnocentrism comes out, and they make life difficult for people who would have provisional status in these settings, if you understand what I'm saying. The most marginalized people in society, whether they're black people, whether they're gay people, whether they're women, whether they're Catholics, whether they're Jews, whoever it is, can feel their provisional status acutely, you see. And black people, because of the history, and this is very important, the history of racial injury in this country, probably feel this provisional status most acutely, you see. But even though they feel it, it doesn't mean that this tears the canopy completely up. The great sociologist Irving Goffman talked about the importance of gloss. That is how we get along, how we behave superficially sometimes with smiles and politeness and and all. We paint ourselves in gloss to operate in these canopies, if you follow me. Again, some of us don't have to work very hard, but some of us do. It's significant that the people who are ethnocentric are actually trying to work to be better, if you know what I mean. The norms are such that they try to be better people, if you follow what I'm saying. A lot of this is in the book, and a lot of this can be dealt with in the book, but this is essentially the argument that I've made. And it's an argument that really is a function, not so much of an ideology, but of what I've come to observe and see. You see? So what I've done is try to represent not some ideology. I'm representing what I've come to see going on in these places, if you follow what I'm saying. So I think I'll close for there and hand it over to Ray, who will now continue the discussion.
Well, Professor, let me start by asking you a question that comes out of the book. Of all the places, the physical places in America, the ones that most logically would have provided that cosmopolitan cover, allowed people of different classes, different origins to mingle, to pass each other, to do business with each other, were cities. Yet for a long time, cities were very heavily coded. Everyone walked around with a mental map in their head of places they thought they were welcome and places they thought they weren't. Does the much easier identification of cosmopolitan canopies in 2011 urban America represent progress that accidentally and unremarkably we can be around and among, however superficially, people who aren't like us?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot has happened over the past 40 years, 50 years, and even through the centuries. Of course, the original cosmopolitan canopies were in Rome, the piazza. You can imagine that, where all different kinds of people would sit around the places and sort of parade around the piazzas. And you fast forward over thousands of years to the present day in time, we in this country undoubtedly had slavery, we had emancipation, we had world wars, we had great migration to the cities, we had riots in black communities, we had the civil rights movement, of course, and we had the racial incorporation process, which has resulted in the largest black middle class ever, which is very significant, very significant. At the same time, we've had a great amount of immigration from all over the world, but especially colored countries, which complicates the caste system that we have had in this country, and this is important. And for so many of these people who were marginalized and segregated, these canopies are now places where they can exist, you see, can be. And it's not just the black middle class and others who come to these places, but it's people from different countries, people from different places, all come together and have this opportunity to get along with one another, you see, get along, to relate to each other, to learn from each other. It really is an opportunity for all different kinds of people to try things out, you see, and they do. And I think it is progress. It is progress. Of course, we have a long way to go. We have a very long way to go, but it is progress. The world today is very different from the way it was 40 years ago, racially in this country and ethnically. And I think ultimately, as the white population becomes fewer and fewer, relatively speaking, and more colored people emerge, the canopies will become ever more integrated, I think, as it were. I think this is a good situation where people can come together, interact with people, learn from each other, and come to appreciate one another's humanity. And this is what the canopy does. See? I'll stop there.
Let me go all the way to the end of the panel. Professor Fox, you've lived and worked in this city a long time. Professor Renee Fox, now emeritus professor, former chair of the sociology department at the University of Pennsylvania. This mingling that's going on, that Professor Anderson identifies in his book, was it just impossible, harder to do, not considered desirable in earlier generations in a city like this or others?
Well, I don't know Philadelphia from my earlier life as well as I know New York, and we were discussing that city before we came into this symposium. In the city of New York in which I grew up, in Manhattan, there was an absolute boundary between 125th Street and what came after that. All African Americans who were not called African Americans then were enclosed within that space. The only black persons who came downtown were domestic servants who worked for white persons and then went back up to 125th Street plus. I myself grew up in some ways, an equally ghettoized neighborhood. It was 100% Jewish, of East European origins, from those of you who know Manhattan, from Riverside Drive to Central Park West, from 96th Street to 72nd Street, and almost all the fathers were in the clothing business. And then there was an island of Irish Catholics who lived on Amsterdam and Columbus Avenue. And we lived within our own enclaves. All my public school teachers, the majority of them were Irish Catholic, with an occasional Jewish teacher. There was a 10% quota for admission to Ivy League colleges, a 10% quota for Jews, a 10% quota for Catholics, and almost inconceivable. I went to Smith. There was one African American woman at Smith at the time, and she was the daughter of Walter White, one of the founding fathers of the NAACP. So if I look from that historical perspective at what the ecology, so to speak, of ethnic and social class and racial groups was in my girlhood, seeing this marketplace, seeing Rittenhouse Square, seeing the gallery as Professor Anderson has depicted them, is revolutionary, and has to have, seems to me, even though it's not necessarily a panacea for all ethnocentricity, the mingling that we do with one another, what Dr. Anderson has spoken of, the opportunity that we have to do folk ethnographic observation of one another, has to have some kind of impact that has implications, I think positive ones, for our greater comity and our greater ease with one another, without suggesting that there are no traces of racism or ethnocentricity left in the current scene.
So both ends of the social transaction feel a little better about themselves after successfully navigating lunchtime in the Reading Terminal Market?
Well, there's a kind of an interesting paradox I wanted to point out. I walk with a walker, and I'm a person of some age. And as I move about in Philadelphia, I'm struck by the fact that I receive a great deal of unsolicited help on the street. People helping me open doors, people helping me get up steps and so forth. One of the things that I notice and that I'm deeply moved by, and that I think Professor Anderson mentions in his book, is that I would say that a very striking majority of the people who offer me that assistance are black. And what's more, they do it with a kind of graciousness and a kind of knowledge of how to help, which is very special. I have great apprehension, for example, when certain kinds of people reach out to help me, and I think that they are probably more dangerous in their desire to help than it would be if I had been left to navigate on my own. What I've been struck by in terms of the African American persons who have been so gracious to me consistently is they've often spoken to me about their own mothers, about older people for whom they care in their own homes, about the fact that they work in hospitals or have had experience in working in hospitals, and also sometimes about the black church. So what I'm reporting is a peculiar kind of reverse observations that I'm making of singling out African American persons as being more likely to reach out to a white woman of age with a walker like myself than their white counterparts. I don't know what you want to make of that.
That will emerge over the long procession of the panel discussion. I don't want to make anything of it yet. We're lucky to have with us the two-time mayor of Philadelphia, Wilson Goode. And he was elected in 1982. He defeated Frank Rizzo for the job. And those of you who lived in Philadelphia then will remember it at a time of heightened racial tension, I think it's fair to say. Mayor Goode, as you look around the city today, do you see the kinds of differences that Professor Anderson is identifying in the cosmopolitan canopy? Is it an easier place, Philadelphia, than it was 30 years ago when you were running for mayor?
There's no question that it's easier. There's no question there's been some progress. But there's no question that we remain a segregated city. And we remain a segregated city, and the cosmopolitan canopies provide opportunities for us to kind of work across cultures and things. And they, of course, can take place in Reading Terminal, Penn's Landing, and as the professor has talked about, 30th Street Station, but also in ward meetings of political ward leaders and people who are joined together by a single purpose of helping to elect someone to office. But the fact still remains that at the end of the day, they go back to neighborhoods that are not cosmopolitan. They attend churches, for the most part, that are not cosmopolitan. And unfortunately, they go to schools, that children go to schools in the city that are not cosmopolitan. So I think that there are more and more people coming together and living that are different. There's more cultural and racial diversity in the city. But I still think that we have a long ways to go in that regard. But I'm struck by the fact that that one of the things that after I read the professor's book this past week, I flew from Atlanta to Dallas, Texas, and and I noted I started to look at the cosmopolitan nature of those who were flying together. But alongside of me was a woman who started to just cry. And I talked with her, and she was from the rural part of the South, and living without question in a segregated neighborhood, and the kind of person that when I was in my younger years living in the South would have not gone near. A lot of reasons, not going near. But I took her by the hand and I started to pray with her because her grandson had been airlifted, and it was just a warm feeling to be there in that cosmopolitan moment that I had with her, and to be able to me, African American minister, to be able to share with her in her faith. And talked about what could happen. So, yes, I think there's been some progress made in the country and in the city, but it remains a segregated city. And I think the challenge for the future is how can we take these moments that we share and have them happen all the time. When I was mayor, I just found a lot of instances where I was placed in places that I would not have been invited to except for my position. Very cosmopolitan, and very provisional. Because the thing I note is that when I left the mayor's office, not one single invitation came to me to invite me to those situations. Not one. So it was provisional. And it was because of position. It was because I was the mayor. And the people who I associated with, I don't even see anymore at this time. I stopped there.
Well, you leave us at a terrific moment in the conversation. Mitch Denier is with us. He's a sociologist from Princeton University, author of some really terrific works of sociology like Sidewalk and Slim's Table and others. Take the ball from the mayor. Do we have to be careful not to read too much into the privilege now in the 21st century of casual interaction between Philadelphians, New Yorkers, Atlantans, who at one time would have been totally in controlled and separate spheres of life?
Well, first of all, I think we need to not read too much into this as a phenomenon of this Obama moment. I think that spaces like these have existed in American cities for decades, and you can think of neighborhoods and of downtown centers in cities like Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Philadelphia, which were cosmopolitan canopies long before Barack Obama was probably in high school. And from the very beginning, when people saw those kinds of places in cities that were divided in the media and that were divided, in fact, by housing segregation and by conflict, they have been trying to make sense of these places in their folk imaginations. And Professor Anderson is the first sociologist to come along and to actually recognize the existence of places like this and to say, what sense can we make of them? And I think that his book gives us a very good beginning. On the one hand, he recognizes surely the possibility that they are an artificial contrivance, but he refuses to go down that road completely. In his discussion of the end moment, he ends the book certainly with a sense that we have to be at least somewhat cynical about their significance, but at the same time, he asks us to hold in balance the possibility that we're moving forward ever so slowly. And I think that one of the things we have to do is ask ourselves, even when we maintain a certain amount of cynicism and a certain amount of sense of the ways in which places like this are artificial and are contrivances, what impact they have on people's lives on a day-to-day basis.
Linda Wright Moore is with us. She's Senior Communications Officer for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and yet very much tied to this city, even as she does her work out in the Philadelphia suburbs in New Jersey. Linda, let's talk a little bit about those spaces and the what the mayor called the conditional nature of being in them. Do you have to put on your best self? Are there rules to being in a place like this, or in an airport terminal, or in a railroad station? Is there a sort of, not cosmopolitan canopy, but a set of, for want of a better term, middle-class norms that they might as well hand out to you on a piece of paper when you come through the door on Filbert or 12th. A set of expectations that everybody brings to sharing this space that sort of acts as the bedrock set of rules that we're going to work with.
Well, I think that there are, to some extent, yes. I think that part of the wonder and the goodness about what happens under these canopies is that people come, they suspend at least some of their presumptions and their reservations about others who are different from them, in exchange for an experience of variety. We like that, you know. We don't all wear, I mean, look at the different color clothes we're wearing. We aren't all wearing black clothes or green clothes. Variety. We all make individual choices, and it's interesting. This is interesting to people. I hadn't worn my hair braided in a long time and just did this the other day, and everybody's talking about it at my job, etc. So we enjoy variety. That's what we come for, and I think the price of that is to suspend the sorts of presumptions that would set you up for a negative interaction when you see certain types of people who are different from you. So, yes, you do have to do that.
Is there a kind of pressure implicit in that?
It can be perceived that way. I think particularly in Elijah speaks of often in the context of the story he's telling about the marginalization and the treatment that young African American males in particular experience in our society. The clutched purse syndrome in the elevator, etc. And I think that for the most marginalized groups, being able to fit into this canopy is most difficult for them. And an image just popped in my mind that I think speaks to this. I live in what's called an inner ring suburb, Wyncote and Cheltenham Township. I have for many, many years. However, I lived before that in some other places. I lived in Lower Merion, and I also lived in Mount Airy, which is still my center of gravity. Because I live in Cheltenham Township, my daughter, who's now in college, went to high school at Cheltenham High School. And one of the things I noticed, and this is a high school that has been gradually tilting towards about a 50-50 white versus black plus Asian mix, with a lot of attendant tensions. I went to see a fabulous production they did of A Chorus Line. They won awards for it. It was fabulous. And that night, there was a mix of people in the audience. But I noticed during the intermission, and they sell things for the school, all the different clubs are raising money, people mill around, they're talking, that the young black males who were scattered through this crowd, it was as if they were there, but they were separate. It was if they were they were almost mocking the presumptions about them. They had hoodies on. They weren't doing anything except they weren't engaged and they weren't mixing. And I think that their marginalization and the powerful way in which there is this presumption that you're not up to any good unless you real fast can prove otherwise, it saddens me. I know from my experience with some of my daughter's friends how damaging that can be from a very young age. So I think it can be very difficult.
So David Karras is a former civil rights lawyer, now constitutional law professor, and a longtime observer of the Philadelphia scene, just sharing social space in a way we didn't before doesn't necessarily shatter old ideas about who the other people you're sharing the space with.
No.
And what they're like.
And I think in the book, it's first of all very readable, but you get a sense of the interactions because what Eli did was basically come here and hang out and socialize with people and observe with a rather keen eye, that's honed over many years. So there's lots of accounts where he sits down and has a meal at the down-home diner, and he sees this and that. One of the problems with the book is if you add up all the calories he ate, he can't be this thin, There's no way he could do that. But if you put that aside, I think this is really understood from my perspective, which is civil rights, in terms of the history of, first of all, the civil rights movement that made anything like the canopy possible, right? It wasn't going to happen until some basic changes. And then what happened is we had a very brief period in the law and also, I think, in the culture where we, for the first time in our history, we decided that racism was wrong. Now, it sounds obvious now. It's such a wrong, but that took us a long time. I mean, I'm old enough to see very well-educated, very sophisticated people throw around racial epithets and ethnic epithets as if it's, just talking about a football game or something like that. So something happened where we made that change, which is terrific. But then we kind of stopped. We kind of stalled. And I think the stall is obvious in why this is unusual enough for him to write a book about it, right? We don't have a lot of these spaces. We never really got to integration in a real social sense. And I think what happened is we kind of defined explicit, malicious racism as wrong. And then we eliminated all the levels in between that contribute to racial power differences, racial resource differences, to realities in the social world. And we just dismiss anything that's not that explicit, malicious racism has no racial significance whatsoever. And the law did this, but I think it happened in society as well. And so what was left in place were not only the heritage of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation, but current racist ideas that groups have about each other. And we didn't talk about that because that was in the territory of it's not explicitly racist, so it's not of any racial significance. So I guess that's the context I see it in.
Professor Anderson, some of the most heartbreaking passages in the book come from people who have had to really think very hard about how to present themselves to the world. And even when they think they've come upon a way to do it that makes sense for them, that will allow them to be accepted in all levels of society, they are slapped upside the head by reality at some point and are either shocked by it or part of them suspected all along that this is what their co-workers thought, that this is what the people who knew them at school thought, and so on. And it was really, some of the stories were small things, but harrowing at the same time. To have your bona fides questioned by someone you thought you knew. To suddenly, in a moment, after being one of us, or you thought you were one of us in the lunchroom or the conference room or in the parking lot, you realized that you were never one of us at all. You're back to being one of them. Talk a little bit about that and how the uneasy existence of both this new cosmopolitanism and some of the same old stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it goes back to this, the notion that David alluded to, civil rights and so much has happened over the years, the riots, but incorporation, racial incorporation. And we've changed so much in the society. We've changed so much. People We have a black middle class today that is bigger than ever, you know. At the same time, we have to understand that that middle class is still dealing with the legacy of caste, the legacy of racial caste. See, it's very important because as people become incorporated into the system, there's always the chance that people can remind you of where you've been and who you used to be or where you should be, your place, so to speak. Now, the thing about the canopy is that people who come under the canopy learn to get along, of course. There's so many places like this, from the Reading Terminal to the Rittenhouse Square to Liberty Place, a lot of different places. And I moved from these public spaces to quasi-public spaces like the workplace. And I think this is what you're alluding to. With affirmative action and this incorporation process, you have black people who are middle class and in positions where they've never been before. We have great numbers of black people who work as corporate executives, as doctors, as lawyers, as professors. And while many, many people are very happy with this and are affirmed to some extent by this, there are many others who feel that their own rights have been abrogated by the presence of these very people there, you see. And so this can be a problem. Many black people in this situation experience from time to time, as you suggested, acute disrespect based on blackness. Acute disrespect based on blackness. Now, very oftentimes, black people joke about this later and say, well, that was my moment, so to speak, my end moment. And other people will talk about the end moment in just that respect. And people can joke about it. It's interesting because it's such a moment as opposed to something that's happening all the time, you see. It's the moment, the moment. Well, the thing of it is, other groups can have these moments too. You can look at other marginalized groups from, not really marginalized, but people who have provisional status, whether they're Jews, Catholics, Asians, paraplegics, gay people, women, whatever, can all run into this issue. But black people can feel it most acutely, in part because of this history of racial injury in this country. And I think this is what the next frontier is. And this is the new color line, the color line that can be drawn any minute. So in the old days, people like W.B. Du Bois and Caton and Drake, they wrote about the race relations in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in various places in the old days. And they spoke very powerfully about the existence of the color line that was supported by the government, that was supported by the law, as it were. Well, today, given the civil rights movement, the successes of the civil rights movement, much of this support has gone by the wayside, you see. It's gone by the wayside. And as I mentioned, black people are all over the place. They're in integrated neighborhoods, they're in corporations and various other places. At the same time, they can be reminded of their place very powerfully through this acute disrespect, you see. And that's where we are today, this acute disrespect based on blackness. That's where we are today. It's not to say that everybody is doing this all the time. It's a moment. It's the moment, you see. And the fact that there is shock about it, as you said, is significant because it's not happening all the time. But when somebody gets to be too high or begins to threaten certain people, then the rug can be pulled out, you see.
See, I went back and forth as I read the book in my own mind, thinking about whether this was just the game and this is what you did to get over, or whether there was something really fundamentally horrible and alienating about having to be somebody else from what you otherwise would be in order to compose yourself to be in a workplace, to be in a school environment, to be a neighbor. That you have to wear this second set of clothes that other people don't have to wear, and you can't let the mask slip either. there must be a tremendous pressure that goes along with that. Mayor Good, you must know something about that.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with you.
Good.
And I think that that one of the things that I have said consistently to my wife and to my family is that you have to always be who you are, regardless of who you're around. And two, that if you're in the room and they don't know that you are black, then you're not being real. And so I don't agree that when you go into go under the cosmopolitan canopies, that you have to fake it. Or you have to act like, oh, isn't it good just to be here among all these other folk that don't look like me? I think it's a healthy experience for people to know who you are. And therefore, you have to present yourself in a way that you enrich them by who you are, and they enrich you by who they are. And if I'm going to become them, then there's no enrichment in the whole situation. So my view is that I do not try and suspend who I am. In fact, I think I try to extend who I am a bit, to make the point that yes, I'm here, but I'm here to make a statement that this is the way it should be everywhere and all the time. Not, I'm glad to be in this provisional state. So that's my response to you.
Linda and then Mitch.
Yeah.
I just wanted to suggest that, there's two. Eli writes about the cosmopolitan canopies here, Rittenhouse Square, to some degree at the gallery, but he also talks about the dynamics of a workplace, and there is certainly a distinct difference insofar as workplace has its own set of parameters, rules, culture. There may be, in terms of who is in charge, some things asked of you that you don't like but you go along with. And I think in one of the vignettes, he tells a story of the young man who is basically very much insulted by his coworkers. At the same time, I understand what Mayor Good is saying, because when you go, part of the idea of the canopy is that you're coming here because you want to experience the dynamic of the difference. So you are not going to change. When I made the reference to having to change some behaviors, there are some basic civilities, and there is a tendency when somebody is on the edges that they will be, even in this environment, sort of looked. It's sort of like the sort of, what they used to have a term for it, the homeless person who's acting up, that kind of thing. So there is a little bit of a difference, I think, between coming to these places to be and enjoy and experience and project difference and what you might have to deal with in the workplace.
I would only say that we should remember at this juncture in the conversation that this is a workplace too, where there are people who are seeking service and people who are giving service, and they have often a very different relationship to each other. And a lot of composition goes on not only around the consumption of the things that are on offer here, which are often, it's what would be called in your guys' games, valorized consumption. Organic foods and craft objects and cookbooks and the wonderful things that are for sale here. But also there is a servant relationship from people who are dealing with hard to deal with customers, people who feel that there wasn't enough cheese on the scale before things got wrapped up in the white wax paper, people who feel that their cone doesn't have enough ice cream on it, or whatever it may be. And that's a social encounter as well that has to be taken into consideration. Go ahead, Mitch Denier.
Well, I would just like to agree with Mayor Good that I don't think that the reason that people participate in these kinds of places in general is with the idea that they're going to go and do something that's fake or phony or a contrivance. I think that they desire to participate in these worlds because they validate their own image of self-worth. And part of the ways in which that happens is that they know that that self-worth is actually contained in a set of behavioral expectations. And they like to be in places where those behavioral expectations are maintained. It's not the same as the street. Out in the street, I walk the way I want to walk, to quote that other famous sociologist, Bruce Springsteen. No, you come to the Reading Terminal Market and you are part of a set of behavioral expectations, and you see your worth in part as being bound up with those as well.
Could I make a comment?
Please, Renee. Professor.
Just listening to these remarks that have just been made, I'm struck by the fact that there is this self-consciousness that people are talking about. For example, wanting to be sure that you present yourself as you really are and as authentically as you are suggests a kind of self-consciousnness about self-presentation in the public that then in a sense people are denying. And I don't know whether Mayor Good would have, what you told your wife and your children, for example, means that you have a certain concern about the fact that they might not present themselves in all their authenticity in public and in the professional context, because somehow or other there's a challenge if you are a black American rather than a white American.
That's absolutely correct. And having grown up in the South, both my wife and I, and having lived through that experience of segregation, of absolute segregation, where you could not find a canopy anywhere. And if it was a canopy somewhere, you were working for others who were under the canopy. And having just spent the years in going to a school that should have been a canopy, John Bartram High School in 1957 to 1958 and 1959, that should have been a canopy, was not. And so there was that consciousness that we developed over the years that we had to be strong and we had to be who we were, and we had to present ourselves in that way. Not that we had to wash our face and put on a different suit, but be who you are and present that in a way that's going to be real. And that's the point which I was really trying to make. So I do agree with you that there is this consciousness always that someone is going to look at you and see you as less than who you really are. And I think that that the term that Professor used was acute disrespect. And I felt that in the South, I felt that in school, I felt it as mayor many times, yes.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, my father was, he had a fourth grade education and he worked in the factories. And he came to visit me in about 1982 when I was teaching at Penn during Thanksgiving. And we went to the campus and we walked around the campus, and he was very impressed by what he saw. And then he came back to my office, and I showed him my office. He was very impressed with that too. And then we went to my home, and we were getting ready to have the Thanksgiving meal, and we were sitting down listening to the blues and drinking drinking beer. And he said to me, and this brings your experience to my mind, but he said to me, he said, well, now, you teach at that white university. You teach white students. I said, yeah. And you work with these white people. Let me ask you one question. Do they respect you? Which took me aback, you see. And that's what it comes down to. Do they respect you? Because he knew in the South that white people did not respect black people. That's what he knew growing up. Now, he was wondering whether his son was now teaching in a place where the people respect you. Do they respect you? And I was lost for words. I said, well, Dad, some do. Like that. Well, you have no reason to lie to your daddy. And I said, some don't, and I'm sure, but it's hard to know which is which sometimes. And I think that kind of gets at what you were getting at. I mean, because he knew coming up in the South under segregation that the white people didn't respect black people. But this was a new day. Here I was teaching at a major university, and by all appearances, had all the rights, obligations, and duties as anyone else. But his question was, and he was just curious, do they respect you? And that it gets back to the point you're making. But to go back to what Ray mentioned and what you raised as well, Mayor Good, was this issue of provisional status. And to have provisional status is to have something to prove. Something to prove, you see. And that's what a lot of people who are still dealing with the caste system, the legacy of caste, are having to deal with, you see. And it doesn't have to be a black person with respect to white people. It could be a white person who's dominated, in a situation dominated by black people, could feel he has something to prove too, you see. It's something to prove, provisional status, which is a major point in the book, provisional status.
But you know that provisional status has not only a social dimension, but a real dollars and cents, hardcore economic dimension. Because if you compare black, Latino, and white families in the United States, the amount of accumulated assets they have, the value of the houses they live in, the school taxes that pay, the capitation for where their kids go to school, it's very different even when you compare workers of the exact same annual income. Middle class status feels more provisional, feels more fragile, especially during this decade that we've just been through, where you may have outwardly all the things that your socioeconomic peers have, and yet feel in a very real way it could all be taken away from you in a way that I think other Americans may be getting used to now, but didn't always feel that way. That may be something new that we all have in common now.
Yeah.
But that fragility of hard-won status is something that's with minority people always, even when it looks outwardly like they've got it made, in a way that I think other people wouldn't necessarily understand or identify with. Does that seem fair to you?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. 'Cause-
Yes,
and
indeed.
you know, it makes consumption zones, the experience of consumption zones like this, I think,
Which-
different as well.
Which raises questions about the canopy itself, because if you have many people who are up against it in terms of economic viability, they're likely to be less generous with others who are outside because of their feelings of provisional status, as it were, or how precarious their status is, given the economy is changing before our very eyes. And there's so much downward mobility and the threat of that.
Well, we've put a lot out there for your chewing over. So let's go to questions. And you can put your questions to a particular member of the panel or to the panel as a whole. All I would ask is at some point try to make it into a question rather than a speech or a statement or just letting it rip for a little while. You know, in English, our voices go up a little bit at the end when it's a question, and it's like there's something you actually want to know from somebody else. You know, help me out here. Ask a question. Yes, sir. If you stand up and in a great big voice so we can hear you.
The question is, the ultimate canopy, in my opinion, is the White House. And I wanted to know if the professor could answer the question, do you believe that Obama, President Barack Obama, is respected enough in that White House canopy? Those folks are coming together today to learn more and more about each other, but I suspect there's a lot of potential difficulties for them giving people credit for their abilities, their intellects, their character. And I think there's a great assortment of conundrums to the problem that face America, the world, when we're coming in there second-guessing decisions made by President America.
Yeah.
Can I repeat your question roughly, not rather than the whole thing? Our questioner suggests that the White House may be the ultimate canopy, and he wonders, given what Professor Anderson said, whether he believes Barack Obama is respected. You've got people coming in from all different centers of power and different walks of life and centers of influence, and do they ultimately respect the president under that canopy?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I mean, he's the president, and of course that means it makes for a certain amount of respect, of course. At the same time, given the legacy of caste in this country, one might argue that for some people, maybe a significant number of people, Obama still has something to prove, as it were, as was shown when Trump wanted to know not only his birth certificate about that, but also about his grades. You know. So this points to this issue of having something to prove. And if you go back to Joe Wilson and the way he shouted out at a State of the Union address, "You liar," I've never seen a president treated that way in that situation, in that kind of forum. And so I think it speaks back to this issue of race and the caste, the legacy of caste that we're still dealing with in this country. There are many white people who support Obama and respect Obama, I believe. There's some, and maybe this will forever be the case, for some people he has a lot yet to prove. He has a provisional status, as it were. And I think that's the way it is. And I think you're right. In a way, the White House is, I mean, the country, in a sense, is a canopy. The city is a canopy, if you follow me, in a sense. It's a metaphor, yeah.
And I recall when I was mayor, and some of those may have forgotten this, but when I was mayor, that Senator Salvatore proposed that the Northeast succeed from the city, and you know that's the disrespect. And the basic view was that we're not going to pay taxes for you to run the city, and therefore we should have our own city over here. Never happened before I became mayor. It has not happened since. So that was an acute disrespect, in a sense, of saying that. And so I think that the Tea Party organization is a very similar type of mindset, that somehow there's something fundamentally wrong with the way this country is going, not because it's going much different than it always has, but because there's a black man in charge. Therefore, it has to be wrong. And the kind of question that get asked not of all presidents and mayors, but only for black presidents and black mayors. And so there is that in the recesses of folks' mind, of some folks, not all of them, of some folks' mind, there is that idea that you have to validate your right to be in the position that you're in. And the fact of the matter is, no matter what you do, you can never validate it, because there's one question after another in that regard.
But on another level, the image that comes to my mind is of the night that President Obama got elected. And the scenes that we saw, to be sure, I saw them on television and I wasn't in the street myself. But some of the most moving scenes I think I've ever vicariously experienced, of that unity of young and old and black and white and every racial, social class, age cohort, united in the street, physically embracing each other, celebrating something that we all were joyous about and that we somehow or other aspire to and share. That doesn't negate what we've just heard about but there's another level, I think, that none of us is quite touching if we don't remember, however ephemeral that might seem to us now, that the nation was united in joy, in celebrating that we had come to that place.
Well, at least 51% were.
Good.
Yes. Who's next? In the back.
You want to repeat it? Or?
What do you see as the future for the canopy? Either increases in cosmopolitanism, decreases in ethnocentrism. Where do you?
Yeah. Well, the canopy is just a very important institution, I believe, and I feel that that it's not a panacea. It's not going to make everybody non-racist or non-ethnocentric. I believe that people coming from the most parochial communities, by visiting the canopy, become marginally more sophisticated for having visited the canopy. It doesn't mean that they become non-racist or non-ethnocentric, but I think, as I point out in the last chapter of the book, they learn better how to act, better how to enact these scripts. The thing about the canopy is that the rules, the norms, are cosmopolitan. And so even the people who are ethnocentric, when they come to the canopy, they have to work. They have to work, and that's very important. So there's a sense in which, by being at the canopy, by experiencing the canopy, by going through the motions, people perhaps become improved, or perhaps more tolerant, or at least more able to act that way. See, the other part of this book, the title, in a funny way, is kind of ironic. I mean, the Cosmopolitan Canopy. What I don't say up front very clearly is that there's a whole lot of gloss in the canopy, you see. Now, Irving Goffman would appreciate this, and he was a good friend when he was at Penn, and I learned a lot from him. But I think that there's a sense in which the gloss is all about, and that's positive in a certain sense, because it means that we're trying to act better, and we're learning and being edified as we go through these motions. Again, the canopy is not a panacea for the structural problems of racism and the economics and all that, but it allows us, I think, to be appear to be better people. We got a long way to go, for sure.
I guess appearing to be better is a start, though, huh? I mean, but think of how little that is. Think of how little that is. We're talking about social grease, the lubricant that gets you through the day.
Sure.
So that you're not all hard edges, that you can slide by people and it's not a great big ruckus, it's just getting over. And even that, we're willing in 2011 to be a little self-congratulatory about, which I think ought to tell us something. Yes.
I think if you're talking about the gloss and the yield, which are the characteristics of the canopy, when one yields the right of way, even if it's a gloss. What I'm concerned about is what our colleague was sharing about the young African American men wearing hoodies.
Yeah.
What does it mean? What is the meaning of yielding for them? And how that disproportionately threatens their own identity, such that they can't maybe participate in the canopy.
Right.
They can't yield as much.
Right.
Did people hear that? The gentleman was asking about the gloss of the cosmopolitan canopy and the sense in which it asks people to yield for each other, create a little space, yield a little right of way. And then he talked about the example that Linda gave earlier of the African American men at the high school play who were still apart from the goings-on, who were not yielded a place in the community.
Yes, and what I would say is that, and I point this out in the book, I introduced the concept of the iconic ghetto, and this is the imagined ghetto. This is the notion that this is where the black people live. And today, black people come from all over the place. They come from Africa, they come from the Caribbean, they come from middle-class black communities. Many black people have never been to the ghetto. But at the same time, many people who've never been to the ghetto have this view of the ghetto. They have it, it's an icon in their mind. So any black person under the canopy is first and foremost associated with the iconic ghetto. And then it's up to that person to disabuse people of the notion that he or she is from the ghetto and deserves treatment that, respect, as it were. Now, to be from the ghetto shouldn't be a matter of respect always, but this is what it is. And so black people operating under the canopy oftentimes have to work to disabuse people that they should be mistreated in certain ways. Now you have to ask too about how and why this image is so powerful, this iconic ghetto. And I think about the ways in which programs like The Wire, for example, just sort of give, the wider society, many of whom have never been to the ghetto, it gives them a view and a whole education about the ghetto, right? But that is very one-dimensional, I believe, you see.
David, and then a final comment.
This has implications then for these boys you see under the canopy, who are not, totally like people believe they are.
David, and then a final comment from the mayor.
I think we're getting at the hardest part of this. It's all the time. It's on primetime TV. There's just violence by young black men. I mean, it's like from 9 to midnight, with a little time out for the news about violence by young black men. The reality is there is violence, and we can't deny it. But I think the beauty of Eli's work, and I'm including this book and his earlier ones that you might want to check out too, particularly Code of the Street by My Lights. He's not only insightful and empathetic to the whole range of people involved in these interactions, he really catches the humanity and understands and presents analyses, sometimes in the way of just talking about someone's life. Sometimes it's more analytical explicitly. Why is there this violence? Why can we understand this as a regular person who has certain options in their lives, and how limited those options are, and what their life really is like? And so, this book is full of that, and I think it's one of the main contributions.
I wanted to say a word about the iconic ghetto. A few weeks after I left the office as mayor back in 1992, I decided that I was going to, having been on display for really about 14 years in public life and only wore suits, I was going to dress down. And I went downtown and parked. And while standing in the parking lot, one of the persons came up and handed me his parking ticket. And he said, and said to me, "You look very familiar, so I thought that you were the parking attendant." And so if you see me today, you will always see me in a suit and tie, because I never want to be confused with a parking attendant.
Yeah.
You're going to have to repeat that one because I didn't hear it. I couldn't hear it.
I didn't know I was going to do all this now.
Related to it.
With the idea of the canopy, how does that complicate even more your notion of the old heads, which is changing very, very dramatically? Mayor Good talked about how he talked to his wife and his kids and the level of social consciousness with how he enters a scene. And that's very different for young people to deal with today in the light of this very diverse community that folk engage in.
Yeah, that's a complicated question for sure. But the old heads, so to speak, have oftentimes been through it. There's a reason for the gray hair, if you know what I mean. And I think that I wasn't referring to you, but this
Because you have none.
I cut mine on. Yeah, but I think the old heads have been through so much, and oftentimes they're quite I won't say cynical, but sometimes quite pessimistic about this, or they're not accepting of this idea that we live in this post-racial society. They don't accept that so easily, if you know what I mean. Very oftentimes the younger people get schooled by the older people after they've had their moment, as it were, you see. But the old folks know enough not to trust everything they see because they've been through so much.
Go ahead, Linda.
Just a couple of thoughts that I didn't get a chance to mention earlier. One of them is that I think there's an interesting area to be explored in terms of younger folks who are much more of the social networking possibilities that have come with the internet and with text messaging and Twitter, saying everything in the world and connecting with the whole world in 140 characters. I think that is a factor that will, going forward, kind of influence the willingness, the ease with which they move in and out of canopies physically, because there are these very interesting and diverse canopies being created with their life, with their little fingers going like this. You know what I'm talking about. And then I also want to mention one other thing that's to kind of get us from that image of the kids who were isolating themselves within what was really their own community. Where I worked yesterday, we had the closing ceremonies for a program we have called Urban Fellows. And it's students young adults actually who are working on graduate degrees and have plans to go forth and do great things out in their communities. One of them was an African American fellow in his probably early 30s with a law degree who talked about his own background and what had gotten him where he was yesterday, celebrating completion of this program and looking forward to a wonderful career. And he said he'd grown up, I believe it was in Atlanta, and had been a nerd as a kid, kind of bright, and then taken this really left turn, or right turn, or wrong turn, that's what it was, where the grades went away, he experienced a friend being shot 6 times and killed who was standing next to him, gangs really messing up. And then he had some kind of epiphany and he changed course and he turned his life around. And I asked him, he didn't say what had made him do it. And so I said, well, what made you do it? And his answer was that one day I just realized and remembered what was expected of me by my parents, by the people, various people in my life who had tried to give me guidance. Something snapped, and I said, do I want to go down this way? So he made a decision. And I like to connect that to what we're talking about different people fitting into the canopy, because expectations is part of what makes those kids in that high school, outside that auditorium act like they don't fit. Those expectations are being visited on them in that environment that you're not expected to do well, you're not expected to participate. Yeah, well, that's what we expect you to do, and then that's what they're living down to. So I think that to the extent that exposure can raise tolerance, and with that maybe assumptions and expectations that this person's going to act this way because they look like this, that the canopies really have an important role to play.
I'd like to use a moment of moderator's privilege, since we're close to the end of our time and moving to a social time, to ask how the recent census figures, if they do at all, got you thinking about the future trajectory of these cities that we've been talking about. W.E.B. Du Bois was right that the problem of the 20th century was going to be the color line, but Latinos are changing that in Chicago and New York and Miami, places where the conflict, such as social conflict was understood at all, was painted strictly in black and white. And now there's just an X factor in the use of social space, in understanding who belongs and who doesn't. There's rising question about the presence of immigrants in the United States and whether they're a legitimate future going forward when there's so much economic distress. When you look at cities like Chicago and New York, where the black population is going down for the first time ever, since Chicago was counted in the census, this last 2010 census was the first time that it had fewer black people than it had in the census before. I think that's a big deal, but I'm not totally sure why yet. So I'm glad I have you all here to answer that question.
Ooh, that's tough.
Whoever wants to get us started.
I thought you were going to say, the census figures here, the city is majority black for the first time, right? Isn't that what came out a few weeks ago? Yeah. Right. I was thinking you were to go in that direction. I think, though, that I don't know whether your response you're looking for is about where are the black people disappearing to.
No, as much as how
what is the
that
Latino,
old binary notion,
of the
urban conflict, of being a largely black and white conflict over contracts, power, electoral office, influence, is being changed by what's going on in the census, what we see reflected in the census.
So the question that you're asking is there any real difference between how the overall society respond to African Americans versus Hispanics? And I would suggest to you that just based upon my travel all across the country, that there isn't very much. And so I'm not, I don't think that because African Americans are beginning to become less of a population in major cities is going to improve the condition of the way this country looks at race. That's my opinion, because I think that Hispanics, Latinos are viewed in much the same way as African Americans throughout, and therefore I think that when you look at the canopy, the question is, will there be in the difference in the neighborhoods which they live in the school in which they attend, in the way that they basically separate themselves. And I spent a great deal of time in prisons voluntarily. In prisons, and the thing that struck me about this notion of canopy in prison is that, and I go and I talk a lot to different to the groups of people, and when they come in, and the African Americans here, the Hispanics are here, and the Caucasians are here, and so even under this roof, they separate themselves in those categories. But I don't think that if this is the question you're posing is there going to be any difference in the near future between the way we look at the minorities in society, because Hispanics, Latinos are now replacing African Americans as the largest minority in the country.
I think we're tapping into a whole other dimension of American history here. I mean, we are all immigrants. We have wave after wave of immigration that's made up this country. Each new immigrant group that has come to this country has experienced experiences of prejudice and discrimination, and that have been, if not totally, but have been by and large gradually overcome. The problem about immigration in the United States opens out onto the world at large, because the degree to which the problems of immigrants in other countries of the world, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, it's a global problem on a whole scale, I think, that is quite different from just confining ourselves to thinking about the movement of those of us who are white and those of us who are black in an American context. Elijah's wonderful book needs another layer, I think. Maybe that should be the Cosmopolitan Canopy Volume 2, in which we can perhaps, through his extraordinary insight and the kind of participant observation that I don't think any of us in this room could replicate. It involves much more than just being an astute observer. If we could watch all kinds of other persons from other social groups moving in that same space, he noticed them, but he focused on two groups only. I think we probably could maybe begin to answer the question that's just been raised with a little bit more perspicacity. I don't think it does. I wouldn't settle for saying that Hispanic Americans are now undergoing an experience which is so comparable to, parallel to, or to say nothing of identical to, what we've been talking about this afternoon.
Just one comment. The central issue in the book is this tension between ethnocentrism and cosmopolitanism. And there's a sense in which the canopy is an edifying institution, and people come from particularistic parochial communities, and they learn better how to act in this cosmo way. That doesn't mean that they buy it all, but there's a sense in which the canopy is edifying and humanizing that experience, and there's a sense in which, I guess, Latinos, black people, different kinds of people who come from parochial communities learn something under the canopy, as it were.
I do think I had an experience about close to 10 years ago of working for about a year and a half on a documentary about health disparities as they impacted Hispanic women. And it was quite a learning experience for me. I do not speak Spanish. I do know quite a bit about health disparities due to some work and a fellowship that I've done. And I just want to make the one point that just as black folks tend to speak up and say, you know, we're not a monolith, we're not all the same, because that's really the fundamental problem here, is making those assumptions, nor are Latinos. They come from different places, they come from different cultures. They may speak Spanish, but they have there's people who've been here for generations, and there's people who are coming. And so I think that part of what they will have to undergo is some recognition that, as in the book, that everybody who is Latino isn't somebody who is an illegal from across the border. They actually come in a range and a variety, and hopefully as their numbers grow, the broader understanding of that will take hold, recognition of that.
Well, we have time built into our program for mingling. I think that's the term of art used in sociology, right? Mingling. So please, this is the reception. You can thank our panelists now. And then thank them in person and ask them the questions that you have for them in person. But thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I can't.